This video is for anyone interested in modifying AdaCAD, developing new features of your own, or just poking around the code out of curiosity. Additionally, I'll assume some prerequisite knowledge. Don't worry if you don't have these prereqs. We're all humans constantly learning, and so I've linked beginner-friendly guides for each item. So hit those up first, then come back here if that's the case. The prerequisites for generally developing AdaCAD and this video are Git and your repository management platform of choice. You should also have Node.js and Node Package Manager or NPM installed. You should also be familiar with some intermediate JavaScript or TypeScript. If you have experience with JavaScript but not TypeScript, it should be fairly easy to pick up. And some basic HTML or CSS. Enough to understand how these files are structured and interact with scripts, so that when you see the directory in the files, you know generally what's going on. With the prereqs, have them installed or have your favorite references on hand. Let's go on to part 1, which is the installation instructions. Now we're pretty much going just through this README on the AdaCAD repo on GitHub. And so we're just going to start here at the development setup. See the prereqs. We're going to first start with cloning this repository and downloading it onto your local hard drive. On the GitHub page, you could scroll all the way to the top, click that green code button, and here you see clone. You have a few different options. If you have GitHub desktop, you can just hit that. It makes it real easy to download. You download the zip and extract it. It took my computer like a couple minutes. It's a pretty big download. I just saved this copy of AdaCAD on my root drive, so my directory will be C/AdaCAD. If you prefer a command line interface or CLI, open up your terminal and run the git clone command. I'm using VS Code, so when I say my code editor and the terminal, they'll be in the same window. So you just open up a new terminal, and the command for cloning the Git repo will just be git clone and the URL of the repo from the Unstable Design Labs GitHub.git. Now that we have all the files downloaded, we're going to navigate our terminal to where we downloaded it. Like I said, I just went to C/AdaCAD. Once you're in that local root directory, from here on, I'll just assume that you're in that folder. We're going to run npm install. This will install all of the dependencies for AdaCAD, all the external packages that it needs to run. So this can take a while. Go and get yourself a nice drink, some tea, coffee, snack. I'm going to leave the video running to see how long this takes. The 21st century version of a watched kettle never boils is a watched progress bar never completes. Once you have it installed, we now also bundled up in that giant bundle, also installed Angular, which is the framework that AdaCAD is built from. So we now have access to Angular's command line interface, which is abbreviated NG. Now that we have all the dependencies that we need to run AdaCAD in your terminal, you can type ng serve. This is the command that will have Angular compile AdaCAD and serve it from your computer. So this will also take a while, not as long as the install, hopefully. If you watch your terminal, Angular will let you know when it's done compiling the app and tells us now we can go to localhost in our browser. That's what I'll do. In this new tab, we'll navigate to localhost:4200. as the Angular CLI instructed us to, and you should see AdaCAD. With everything set up from part 1, now we're going to open our code editor in the root directory in VS Code. I added the folder to my workspace just to show both the app and the code that is building it. I have split my window. So let's take a look through the AdaCAD file directory and see how these files are organized. Much of this organization follows Angular's provided style guides in their documentation, so we'll keep going through the README on the Git repo and quickly review some Angular concepts. Right now, ignore everything else. We're really only interested in the source folder and app in that folder, so source/app folder. Ignore everything else out here. We'll start with going over Angular modules. Once you're in source app, you'll see 3 subfolders: core, mixer, weaver. Each of these correspond to one of AdaCAD's modules. Angular apps like AdaCAD are organized into modules, which are bundles of functionality. For AdaCAD's 3 modules, core handles the fundamental features that aren't specifically related to weaving or design, but like make it an app, like providing the information top bar in here, the sign-in feature, logging in to load previous designs. The mixer module is really the main module of AdaCAD that gives the user this wide open palette where you can drag around operations to mix and match drafts and generate weaving designs. Weaver, the 3rd module, is a secondary design module that actually opens or comes into play when you want to edit a draft in finer detail. So I'm going to click here on this one I had in the palette, and you can see the Weaver module is what's driving this pop-up, this view into the design. You can really think of each module as representing a different view into your design. So the next Angular concept that we will look at in AdaCAD are components. Within each module, let's open up core here, you'll see a bunch of subfolders. These all represent components, except for the provider folder here, which holds services. We'll get to that later. For now, think of components as pieces of the view that AdaCAD gives the user into their design. Services are the background workers. For example, currently in the AdaCAD window, the top bar is a component. This operation and draft, kind of this whole node, is a component, and the sidebar is. And you can see generally the names of the components correspond to their function. To sum up this Angular pattern, components don't edit the design data. Services handle how the data gets transformed in the operations, drafts, and other data structures in AdaCAD, while the components render this data and provide the user inputs to interact with these services in the backstage. Let's open the sidebar component, and here we could see the 4 main files that make up a standard Angular component. You have HTML, you have SCSS, which I think is just special CSS. You have a .spec.ts file, which generally you really don't need to ever touch. It's mostly auto-generated. And then you have the .ts file. Again, TypeScript is JavaScript with types, and this .ts file is the main functionality of a component. So when editing a component, you'll probably mostly be working in the HTML and the TypeScript files. Let me open them up here. If you're familiar with HTML, it is really dictating the structure of how a component is loaded in the browser, how it appears. So you can see in the sidebar HTML, we have buttons that correspond to each of its subcomponents. You can nest components inside components, and basically it's just laying out each of the parts. the TypeScript file, the .ts file, is controlling and really giving the functionality to what happens when you click X button or some other button. What happens to other components? Can this component maybe send data to a different part of AdaCAD? And so on. So yeah, generally you'll be working in HTML for the structure and content template layout, and the TypeScript for the functionality and dynamic content. You might also spend some time in the CSS to adjust how things are laid out, how buttons should change appearance when they're being interacted with, so on. And again, you probably don't ever need to touch the .spec.ts. I haven't had to. Let's hop from the core module over into the mixer module, because that's the main module. We see that mixer has its own component because the mixer does represent this main window that the user opens when AdaCAD starts. Like the other modules, it is divided into subfolders with components. Like I mentioned, you can nest components within one another. You can have a component that really represents the face of a module, and these nested components are called child components. Because components each have their own HTML file, you can really map them to the HTML element that they belong to in the AdaCAD window. This is why I have the screen split and both open. Sometimes crawling all these subfolders can get really overwhelming. So to help me get another view on where certain features are located or which components are sharing data, I'll look at AdaCAD running in my browser and open up the inspector. On Windows, this would be right click, and you get this menu. On Macs, it would be command click. And I'm using Chrome, so inspector might be called something else. But in the inspector, which gives you a direct view of the HTML and JavaScript being displayed, you are seeing the source of the page. And you can look through the different HTML tags and see when you hover over each box which HTML element maps to which component. So let me see. Let me find one that we will recognize. App top bar. So you see when I hover over app dash top bar, app dash top bar is the element that represents the top bar component. When I open it up, you see that each part of it highlights. It's just a way that helps me navigate the AdaCAD structure. So with that brief tour, let's just go back into the mixer module HTML and doodle around. This is all the editing we'll do in this video. I'll get much more into actually modifying AdaCAD in later videos, but this is more to orient you to the development environment so that hopefully you're not totally overwhelmed. You know what references to look at to help you edit the code and so on. All right, let's go into Mixer, and we're going to open up the HTML. I'm going to close this inspector. And in the HTML, you can see here the HTML element app top bar appears again. Just go and type in hello world between the top bar and the next element, which actually happens to be a giant container that contains the rest of AdaCAD. Once you have typed it, just save your work, and you'll see in the terminal that AdaCAD should automatically recompile. So you should see Angular automatically recompiling the app. And when it's done, the browser will also automatically refresh. And we could see our change reflected in the browser. We see a little bar that says, hello world. As an exercise, try typing text in other parts of the HTML just to see where it shows up and where the HTML is generating in the app.